in the mixed ownership model for these companies is bad. Thank you.
Ian Lees-Galloway.
Oh, thank you very much, Mr. Chair. It was a big call, I know. Tauhen RA thinks that was a pretty good call.
A point of order, Brendan Horan.
Mr. Speaker, this was brought up earlier by
yes,
the
well,
Honourable Mr. Peters.
listen, please sit down. We're not going to have a debate every time I make a call. I'm keeping a score of everybody that's here, and proportionate to the number of members in the House, the member would see that I deliberated long enough. I saw both members. And we're not going to get into points of order in this regard about who gets the call. Ian Lees-Galloway.
Oh, thank you very much, Mr. Chair. And what was that, Mr. Henare? What was that, Mr. Henare? Would you care to repeat that one for the record? No. Now, Mr. Henare, I'm sure we'll take a call on National's asset sales bill. That's what we're debating this afternoon, part one of National's asset sales bill. The bill, Mr. Chair, that is robbing the future by selling off something that was paid for in the past. That's what part one of this bill does. It robs future generations of their birthright by selling off the effort of past generations of New Zealanders. That's the one and only thing that this bill does. It is the implementation, Mr. Chair, it is the implementation of National's irrational ideological obsession with asset sales. It is the one policy that comes up time and time again whenever National's in charge. The only thing they can think to do is to flog off the assets. Flog off the assets, mostly, Mr. Speaker, mostly because they're bereft of good ideas, but it has to be said also because they have some people in their pockets who will do very well out of the sale of state assets. The taking away of the dividends from those assets that go to all New Zealanders and concentrating those into the 1%. The few who will actually be able to afford to buy these shares. Mr. Henare is being told off by the whip, he's in a bit of trouble. The few who will be able to afford these shares that the government is putting up for sale. Now, Louise Upston's a sensible member. She's got Tauhen RA under control. That's good to see, Mr. Chair. Now, look, Mr. Chair, I would like to address Clause 6 of the State Asset Sales Bill. And Clause 6 is, of course, the clause that removes the former state-owned enterprises, or the former totally state-owned enterprises from the purview of the Ombudsman by removing them from the schedules in the Ombudsman Act. Now, of course, the reason for doing this, or the result of doing this, is to remove from New Zealanders the ability to refer concerns they have with these companies to the Ombudsman, to an impartial and independent investigator who will be able to look at any concerns that New Zealanders have with these companies. So not only is the government taking away New Zealanders' birthright by giving their mates the opportunity to suck up all the dividends from these assets, but also they are removing New Zealanders' democratic right to have a right of referral to the Ombudsman with any concerns that they might have with these new or with these organisations which will now have an element of private control as well as state control. The intention of the Crown is that although it's retaining 51% of the voting rights, let's be clear about that, and no part of this legislation actually ensures that the Crown retains 51% of the ownership rights of these companies, but it does ensure that the Crown retains 51% of the voting rights. Despite that, this government thinks it's appropriate to remove the New Zealand public's right to have to refer these companies to the Ombudsman and indeed to apply the Official Information Act to those organisations as well. This diminishes the oversight, the public scrutiny and the consumer protection that the Ombudsman Act and the Official Information Act currently allow for. And it makes it impossible for ordinary New Zealanders for members of Parliament, for interested community organisations, to hold those organisations to account, to monitor the practices of those organisations. For example, if they show the same behaviour that we have seen from every privatised organisation, from every privatised power company, and put their prices up in an unreasonable and unjustifiable way, the public has no right to refer that issue to the Ombudsman. That's what this government is taking away from New Zealanders, their democratic rights. That's what is being removed under Clause 6 of this bill. And of course, Mr Chair, what we know, Mr Chair, is that the government is also taking away the application of the Treaty of Waitangi to the private shareholders in these companies. Now, how that is going to be discerned between the activities of the private shareholders and the activities of the Crown, I don't know, but maybe one place that you could take that question to is the Ombudsman. No, that right is being taken away. So while we look at the application of the principles of the Treaty of Waitangi, while we look at the requirement for these organisations, for these companies to act in the social good interests of New Zealand, there is no option for us to refer questions about those requirements back to the Ombudsman. The Ombudsman, who is an independent investigator, who can investigate complaints, who could have investigated complaints about these companies. Those two acts, the Ombudsman's Act and the Official Information Act, are the sole security nets or information conduits that are currently available to ordinary New Zealanders in situations where there is concern about the activities or actions of government organisations or local government organisations. And I would point out, Mr Chair, that the other mixed ownership model companies that are out there that this government has been so pleased to promote, they actually fall under the purview of the Ombudsman's Office as council-controlled organisations. So on the one hand, we already have a good example of how the Ombudsman's Office could still have a jurisdiction in the realm of mixed ownership model companies, but not for this government. They do not want this scrutiny. They do not want this scrutiny. They do not want and there's a kind of lack of scrutiny that we see in fully privatised companies. And one has to suspect, Mr Chair, that that is actually where this government is taking these former state-owned enterprises to full privatisation. That, in fact, must be the only reason why Clause 6 is sitting inside this bill. The Chief Ombudsman, Beverly Wakeham, doesn't think this is a good idea. She says it's unjustified on commercial grounds and will see a valuable part of the democratic process lost. The sale of a minority shareholding in these companies does not affect the reasoning for them being subject to the independent oversight and accountability provided through the Ombudsman Act and the Official Information Act. And even Ms Wakeham says that there are plenty of safeguards already within the Official Information Act and the Ombudsman Act to make sure that any issues of commercial sensitivity and disclosure around those can be mitigated. I certainly know this from having to try to get commercial information out of Kiwi Rail. And they constantly cited the clauses of the Official Information Act that said that they were not able to provide that commercially sensitive information. These mixed ownership model companies would be able to do the same, Mr Chair. There is no reason, no justifiable reason for Clause 6 to remain in this bill. Partially privatised, council-owned businesses have already proven that ongoing obligations under the Local Government Official Information Meetings Act and the Ombudsman Act did not put them at a commercial disadvantage when compared to fully private companies. Ms Wakeham says there's no evidence that continued coverage under the OIA would place these companies at a competitive disadvantage. So, Mr Chair, we come back to the question. Why is Clause 6 even in this bill? It is purely about removing people's democratic rights and the right of referral to an independent investigator so that the public has the right to continue monitoring these companies which are still 51% owned by the public. These companies which will have a huge impact on people's daily lives due to their ability to set the price of electricity. This will have a massive impact on people's day-to-day lives. New Zealanders deserve the right, Mr Chair, to have an independent arbitrator that they can go to refer any issues that they might have with these companies. The sole reason National is so hell-bent on having Clause 6 in this bill is to remove the democratic rights of New Zealanders.
Tracy Martin.
A good call, Mr.